The social justice activist Phelisa Nkomo has slammed authorities for what she says is the silence over teenage pregnancy in schools. A Statistic South Africa report from 2020 revealed that there were 33,000 teenage mothers. Among the underage pregnancies, 660 births were attributed to girls as young as 9 and 10. Nkomo joins me now for this conversation. Nkomo, a pleasure to have you on the program this afternoon. You've clearly voiced how disgusted you are at the silence around the alarming number of girl children who are falling pregnant since the beginning of the pandemic. You go further to also express your reservations about simply describing this as teenage pregnancies. Please explain further.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon to the viewers. I mean, absolutely, it's actually quite disgusting that, in fact, this conversation has not found its way into dinner tables at family level, in community meetings, but as well as actually in boardrooms where actually people who are meant to be taking decisions regarding this matter have actually really swept it under the table. I think the second issue is that, I mean, this is actually not a teenage pregnancy, by the way. In fact, South Africa is not confronted with a teenage pregnancy crisis. It's actually confronted with child rape crisis. So, for instance, as you highlighted the statistics, I mean, Save the Children, actually, part of the data they pulled out, just late last year, indicates that, out of the 26,000 that you've actually highlighted, I mean, almost 934, it's actually children under the age of 14. Now, you tell me that children under the age of 14, I mean, when have they started to become sexually active? So it's clear that in our families and within our own households, we actually, children are exposed or staying with rapists. And we call this teenage pregnancy. Because sometimes when we call it teenage pregnancy, the assumption is that, children have actually gone out and they've been searching for boys and asking for boys to impregnate them. In fact, I just want to even link the story that you highlighted earlier about what the MEC was saying. I mean, it's rather unfortunate that people who are in public office make such vague statements. I think it's important to focus on girl children's education, but also equally on boys, because it's not girls that impregnate themselves. Now, one of the key issues that also we have in this country, it's how masculinity has embedded itself within the education system, where, for instance, when girls are actually pregnant, they are stigmatized and they're compelled to drop out, and where boys who would have impregnated the girls continue with their lives as though nothing has actually happened. So that's why I'm saying that her comments are rather unfortunate. In fact, actually, she needs to be able to tap into the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence, which articulates very well what needs to be required, what needs to be done. The first issue the NSP articulates is the need to change social norms, exactly change those kind of comments that you're making, but in fact rephrase them to say that we need to invest in positive masculine education, we need to invest in foundational programs for boys and girls, but also to actually make it sure that there is transformative information for children, but also galvanize communities on issues around reproductive health, but also when boys and girls are going through sexuality change within their own bodies, that there needs to be an investment in education, instead of making vague statements that close your legs and open your books, right? And I find that so not only 1900s, but also so patriarchal embedded. And I do think that the MEC needs to withdraw that statement. And in fact, I call as well on women's rights organization and feminist movement to also take time to invest in actually educating, people who are in public office. I'm not going to say women in public office, because also we do find both women and men who make such a stereotypical statement and shaming and stigmatizing girls.
It's quite interesting that you also reflect on the remarks being made by the MEC, and as a reminder, she does stand by her comments, saying that she will not retract her comments, encouraging girls to open their books as opposed to opening their legs. But let's take this conversation a bit further. When looking at the socio-economic conditions of women, especially young women in rural areas, what in your opinion would you say is at the heart, or what would you attribute to these multiple problems, including what you've described as a form of economic abuse against women and the girl child?
I mean, one of the key issues, and sadly, is that, rural communities have, historically have actually contributed, both in contribution in terms of labor provision, for a well-established modern economy. Amongst those is actually, agricultural development, providing food to urban areas. Now, this is really according to economic theory. But in fact, you've seen a reverse now, where you find that firstly, there are no productive activities where both young women, and as well as just communities that are involved in. In fact, I call it in one of the pieces I recently wrote, that in fact, rural communities have such an extractive relationship between the mainstream economy, and it's not meant to be like that, and it's the failure of industrial planning. So the key issue now, what needs to happen, is that firstly, we need to invest in agricultural development, because agricultural development could actually reverse some of the challenges that we're confronted with, which amongst those is this rapid urbanization that we've seen, where people move into the cities with the hope of securing, good job, with either with people with no skills or semi-skills, and even some of them who are actually unskilled. Then the second issue where there's an important issue is what I call decentralization of industrial activities that needs to move to rural areas. So we need to activate local food markets, for instance. So what you see in rural areas is that a lot of people in rural areas have a connection to the cities or metropolitan areas through either their children or some relatives. So there's a remittances that move between the cities and rural areas. But those remittances are actually used for consumption, not for productive activities. So in essence, it means that young people, when after school, they absolutely have nothing to do. Right. In fact, one of the observations I was making recently when I went home to Butterworth was that people are actually building beautiful houses. But the issue is that people get to enjoy the beautiful houses only in December. So for almost 11 months, they are in the cities and trying to raise income and selling their labor, to earn a bit of an income. But in fact, where you see these beautiful houses, there's absolutely no activities. There are no youth centers. In fact, there are no recreational activities. So in essence, young people have actually no one to do hand-holding. But also at the same time, rural communities have no economic activities. So women are actually involved in this unpaid social reproductive work, where they're raising children and they run, they have a small gardens, but in terms of them actually undertaking, formal work or actually running their own businesses, there are no such opportunities. Instead, you see actually, an exponential growth of informal sector, where people are just putting in their stall with minimal support from the local municipalities, let alone having access to financial support. And it would mean that those women would actually, be selling tomatoes and sweets, for another 10 years. I had a conversation with one of the women that I actually knew when I was still at high school. And she had had a stall for almost, 25 years with no support from the local municipalities. So I do think that there needs to be a very clear reconfiguration of our own industrial policy. And at the heart of it is to make it sure that you bring in agricultural development as the key issue to deal with food security. I'm not sure if you're aware that South Africa is a nationally food secure country, but it's at a household level. It's actually insecure. Here in Gauteng, for example, alone, 25% of citizens go to bed without food. So it means that agricultural development is such a crucial sector to really reorganize South Africans, but at the same time to make it sure that you really, the president was talking recently about a social compact, and I call it a new social contract with the citizens. So in essence, food security could be one area, and then the next one could be infrastructure. If you look at the rail infrastructure across, the Golden Triangle, which is Gauteng, KZN, as well as the Western Cape, is dilapidated, and it presents massive opportunity. Rail infrastructure, road infrastructure. So there are multiple interventions that needs to be undertaken, and within that, you can then start integrating young people whom today we're sitting at 72% of them doing absolutely nothing, and then you integrate women and support women who are actually doing precarious jobs within the economy with absolutely no social security.
It's also quite interesting that you've also argued that race, class, as well as spatial location should be included in the tools of analysis. Talk us through those assertions.
Just say it again.
I'm saying it's quite interesting that you, in your piece, you also cite or argue that race, class, as well as spatial location should be included in these tools of analysis. Talk us through those assertions.
Yes, I mean, and this is a very important issue actually, because the issue of allocation of resources in the economy. So in this context, what National Treasury does, what the Industrial Policy Department do, needs to make it sure that when they allocate resources, amongst the key issues they need to say, who are the people in this country who actually experience economic exclusion the most? It's black people, it's black women, it's rural communities, it's working class communities, and as well as young people. So that's the first issue. So it means that, so in our planning, we have to make it sure that we are quite deliberate and ensure that if, for example, we have to allocate a rand for economic activities, it means that we need to make it sure that almost 80% of that looks at where we experience the most poverty in this country from a geographic perspective. It's a black township. I mean, the urban poverty is actually a huge crisis. I mean, I often say that, for instance, Gauteng will remain a politically charged province. I mean, I don't know if you're aware that Gauteng has had almost, 300 to 500 demonstrations.
Right.
And the reason you have that is because citizens are not getting their fulfillment in provinces where they come from. So they are moving to Gauteng. So citizens from the Eastern Cape, from Free State, from Limpopo. So in essence, if you then allocate funding, you need to say, where are the pressure points in terms of poverty? It's rural women, it's urban black townships in particular. You then need to say, who do you allocate it to? It's black women, right? And I think that's where the race and class and working class communities, for example. So, and we've not had this kind of like open conversation. And part of that inclusion of gender, class, race, and a special location, it needs as well to be embedded in the planning. So the current planning process in South African government is so quantitative driven. And that's why these aspects are often overlooked. And even if they do, but there is no qualitative assessment of looking and saying, if we've allocated a rand to do the following things, what is the qualitative outcomes or developmental outcomes? But instead, we are quantitative in reporting, and in essence, we don't know the impact that we're actually making. And that's why these elements of race, class, and gender in spatial, I'm calling that it be integrated, and that the reconfiguration of financing the areas where are much more poor it's a conversation that needs to take place, but also the allocation needs to take place much more faster to make it sure that you lift those who are trapped in poverty out of poverty.
Now, we are fast running out of time, but before I let you go, I also want to speak about your observations. You also cite that women have always been classified politically and socially as second-class citizens in the country and are also sexually objectified. I mean, sex for jobs, for instance, is still remains a huge issue in our society. Explain to us very quickly what your observation has been in this regard.
No, in fact, the issue of jobs for sex is endemic in public sector, right? Particularly in local government. I mean, when women are looking for simple store, right, they need to be able to make sure that they are nicer to the people who are actually allocating the stalls, including avoiding harassment from the police. So in essence, the issue of sex for jobs, it's a huge issue. And in fact, one of the key things is that even though there are instruments that are actually designed to make sure that people report that, but often women don't report that because either they're scared of destroying their relationships, but also of actually ending up losing the actual job that they do have. So in essence, I think as society, this is something that we need to openly speak about it, but also encourage women to report it because it's an area that in fact gets moved under the carpet. By the way, South Africa has just rectified Convention 190 on sexual harassment, gender-based violence in the workplace, which in fact, again, the issue of sexual objectification of women is actually quite rife, where women would have to actually provide sexual favors for them to be guaranteed jobs. And more women, as well as middle-class women, are fighting lonely battles when if they don't conform to the organizational culture of the company, where they would be, where the organizational culture, it's likely to be that they need to be able to sleep with certain people who are in powerful position. They actually get excluded, or sometimes they get just pushed out of, and we hear that they've signed a non-disclosure agreement and they're pushed out of the workplace. So this is actually a much more bigger battle than actually we think, because it's linked to the whole, gender-based violence. So workplaces as well needs to make it sure that there are clear policies on gender-based violence, but also at the same time, women are actually encouraged to make sure that they report such cases, so that because the evolution or the change of organizational culture on sexual objectification will only come to an end when there's an increased reporting, and that people who report are not publicly shamed, but in fact society embraces them, so that we open up and make it sure that we create safer workplaces for women, and that women are able to. And I think sometimes in cases, I know some viewers will be saying there are men who are subjected to sexual harassment. Exactly. I think as a feminist movement, we are clear that anyone who, for any other reason, would subject any worker or into sexual objectification must actually be brought into the book and actually be exposed.
Nkomo, unfortunately, that's all the time that we have. That was social justice activist Phelisa Nkomo giving us a wide-ranging discussion there, including the apparent silence, especially on the part of government, when it comes to actively tackling the scourge of young women falling pregnant, especially those who are still in school.